35 centuries ago, the leader of an extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional civilization dictated an astounding political message, letter by letter, to a self-exiled Egyptian prince in the western desert mountains of modern Saudi Arabia. That document is known today as the Torah, or translated, the Teaching. Within the Teaching is a timeline keyed to the ancient zodiac as it was at the time of the Exodus. In the opening verse of that message, the leader declares Kardashev Type 5 status as the creator's civilization, thereby declaring ownership status of our planet and ourselves. It goes on to declare it is creating a set-apart people to serve as a sign to the rest of humanity. If you follow the timeline as a link to coming great leaders and key disasters for that people, it is discovered again through the ancient zodiac. It reveals a pattern and a prophecy that unfolds over the next 35 centuries. Hi, I'm Rex Hudson. I'm going to be your guide to this part 2 of the Yahweh. To understand the statements that I just made, we first of all have to become familiar with the wheel of stars. In other words, the zodiac. To do that, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, how old is the teaching? Is it really ancient in nature, and how ancient? Secondly, how did the ancients think about the zodiac in those days? And how do they view the zodiac? In other words, what were the shapes of the things they saw in the sky? To get answers to that, we're going to present information that the teaching has been in its current form for at least 200 BCE. Now, we have scraps and pieces and quotes from the teaching going back about 1,000 years before that, but we don't actually have copies, even though stories tell us it was written approximately 1400 BC. We don't actually have a document, or at least not yet. But there's two things that indicate quite clearly that it was in its current form by 200 BCE. The first is a document called the Septuagint. Septuagint is a Greek version of the Torah, which was written in Hebrew. And because that's been preserved as a separate tradition, and we know the historical time of its creation, we can be sure that it was 99+% in its current form at the time that document was created. Now, it wouldn't be unusual in the last century to run into somebody who would argue that the entire Hebrew Bible was actually created by medieval Jews in Europe. And it would be difficult to argue against that. But something happened in 1948, and that was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls are most universally agreed to have been hidden away during the first Jewish war against the Romans, hidden away and not touched. And those were copies of earlier documents, and that pretty effectively places that date of its existence just as we have it today at that moment in time. That's a pretty amazing leap, but that's over 2,000 years. But we're going to be talking about time in a kind of, how do I say, it's 2,000 years from now to the time of the Romans. It's 2,000 more years to the height of the pharaohs. And it's 2,000 more years to the time that begins our narrative. The teaching is keyed to the way the ancients viewed the zodiac at the time of the Exodus. And so if we think of the zodiac as it is today, we'll lose valuable insight in what is being conveyed to us. You're probably all aware of the modern zodiac, whether you believe in it in the slightest or not. Almost everyone recognizes the signs. There's 12 that are almost universally accepted, 13 according to some, but that's a separate issue. But two things have been happening in the zodiac in the last 2,500 years. Prior to 2,500 years ago, the zodiac was viewed as being applicable to the futures of nations and kings. But in the last 2,500 years, the idea has come about that the zodiac applies to everyone, and therefore there has to be equal signs available and information. I first got exposed to this as a young person. When I was a teenager, my mother did, I believe it's called a chart of me. She got into astrology for a bit, and it was amazingly accurate. And so I, promptly got books and got some of my own and studied, and quickly came to the conclusion that the zodiac, telling future was nonsense. But my mother knew me a whole lot better than I ever dreamed. So if we leave the 12 that are known today, and we can say something about how the ancients viewed the zodiac through something called the Dendera Temple. The Dendera Temple was dedicated to Hathor in Egypt. Its construction is dated to about 100 BCE, so not really that ancient. But on the roof of the temple are multiple images of the night sky, and therefore it gives us an idea of what the ancients viewed the shapes and size of the constellations as at that time. That night sky, though, we have good reason to believe is actually copied from a Mesopotamian image that was approximately 400 or 500 years older. Now that's still a long way short of the time, that 1400 plus years BC of the giving of the Torah. But there's been some things that have come to light in the last few hundred years, and that is in Mesopotamia, in the clay and dirt there, we've discovered bits and pieces of libraries that can have detailed information on astronomy and astrology. Chief of those, the most amazing, is a document called the Mula Pen. It's a document which literally means the stars of the plow. And it tells us a great deal about how the ancients saw the zodiac at that time. Author Gavin White wrote a great book called The Babylonian Star Lore, which is approximately the same time period as the giving of the teaching. And here is his view of how the ancients saw the zodiac. They had the 12 signs we know of today, but they took and divided Pisces into 3 separate constellations. In other words, instead of being 2 fish bound together, they viewed the binding cord, the first fish, and the second fish as being separate. In addition to that, they added 4 constellations, which we know today: Orion, Perseus, Auriga, and the Pleiades. They added those to the zodiac, even though we don't consider them they're constellations, but not part of the zodiac as we know it. That gave a total of 18. If we can see the images, these are outlines created using the Dendera zodiac for the shape. We have Aries, the ancients knew as the shepherd, we know as the ram. We have the Pleiades, which the ancients called the star made of stars. Here's Perseus, which the ancients believed was the old man. Then we have Taurus the bull, the great bull of heavens to the ancient. Then we have Orion, which they knew as the loyal shepherd. Auriga, the crook, not crook in the sense of robber, but crook in the sense of a shepherd's crook. Now, honestly, on the Dendera, there isn't an illustration we can place that looks and say with accuracy as Auriga. So we've kind of used a little creative license here. Here's the shape, because Auriga is normally in early versions pictured as a shepherd kneeling or crouching, holding a sheep in its arms. Then we have Gemini, known to the ancients as the great twins. Then Cancer, or the crayfish, depending on whether people lived at the ocean or on a river. Then we have Leo, the lion, which is instantly recognizable. And then we have Virgo, the virgin. They say she has in her arms wheat sheaves, but I don't see it. Then we have Libra, the scales. Scorpio, the scorpion. Sagittarius, the ancients called it the overseer. Then we have Capricorn, the goatfish, and Aquarius, which the ancients knew as the great. Then the fish of Pisces, first and second, and the binding cord between the two. Okay, if we lay these out using the zodiac as we know it today, we'll see all the additions are actually clustered on one half of the zodiac, not evenly distributed. But it's interestingly, these went overhead in the evening, at night. If you were a shepherd or you were just somebody that was familiar with the night sky and you woke up at a certain time of the evening, you would tell roughly what time it was from the position of the stars of the zodiac above you. You know whether it was early and it was to just go back to sleep, or was it close to the time to wake up and start your morning fire for breakfast. Important piece of information to know. There was a second rotation in which the zodiac went around in the course of a year. It moved simply about 1 degree each night, so in 365 days, you got a complete rotation. This was important because it told the times and the seasons. And the reason that's important is you can imagine leaving too early for your winter campground could get somebody frozen to death. Planting a crop too early could result in freeze and destruction. Keeping the crop out too late could lead to destruction with the winter coming. So the time of the year was important, and that also was brought to people by the zodiac. There was a third motion, though, that generally is thought to have not really been conscious to ancients until the time of the Greeks, and that is called precession of the equinoxes. Now, this is something that can be made incredibly difficult and obtuse, but let's just simply say that the order in which the constellations appear in the sky shifts about 1 degree every 70 years. Now, it's doubtful any one person could have observed this for a number of reasons, but it does show up over the period of time. We know this because the most ancient civilization which has left us, records we can read is the Sumerians, and they began their calendar in springtime with the constellation we know as Taurus. The civilization which followed behind them, the Akkadians, about 1,500 years later, they began their year with the Pleiades. The Romans, about 1,000 years after that, started their year, same thing in the springtime, but with Aries the ram. When the Christians inscribed this sign onto the walls of buildings and whatnot, yes, they were clandestinely identifying themselves as Christians, but further, they were declaring the age of Pisces was arriving, and that's the symbol of the fish. And then finally, when the moon is in the 7th house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. When the fifth dimension sang that song, the authors and they were declaring that we were coming close to the age of Aquarius, the next sign in the wheel of stars. I might argue with their timing, but you get the concept. Okay. Now, the teaching itself has some time hints in it. We've touched on one already, and that is day begins at sunset. The way the teaching says it is the evening and morning of the first day. In other words, they viewed the day starting with evening and ending it with the evening coming again. And that's a little backwards from our view of thing, but as a coach, I've often recommended people to take on this philosophy, because you'll find if you start planning your day for tomorrow before you go to bed at night, you'll just be amazed by how many times you wake up with a new plan that's much more effective than one you went to sleep with. The second part of it, the year begins in the spring, specifically the spring equinox. Now let me add, you're going to discover as we go forward in this message we're talking about is not aimed at the Jewish people. While it's centered on them, it's aimed at the rest of us. Because the Jews have some specific modifications of that springtime year beginning. And I won't go into them right now, but just say it's important that we understand the difference. This message is for the rest of us. And then finally, the place to measure things from is Jerusalem. Now, in the teaching itself, Jerusalem only comes up one time, and that's being the home of somebody called the righteous king, or my king is righteous. And, but anyone familiar with Hebrew teachings knows that Jerusalem becomes core to everything over the passage of time. And then finally, we need to know the creation of Adam. When did that actually occur? Now, a lot of people have taken stabs at that. Probably the most famous is Dionysius Exeges. Dionysius said that the beginning of the Torah, in other words, the creation of Adam occurred in exactly 4000 BCE. And that was so popular that when we say the year as I speak right now is 2018, we're using Dionysius' scale. We may not think about it, but we are. But James Ussher, the prelate of Ireland, came up with, in a book he called The Annals of History, a modification, and he moved it back an astounding 4 years after reviewing the biblical and extra-biblical information. That stood for a few hundred years, and then last century, Edwin R. Thiele did some work, and he said during the time of the Hebrew kings there was confusion came about because the two kingdoms running parallel to each other were using different calendar systems and different ways of determining regnal years. And that came to about 45. So when we apply that adjustment to Mr. Ussher's work, we come to a beginning date of 3959 BCE. Now, I'm going to offer to you something very important happened at the spring equinox in 3959 at sunset in Jerusalem. Something that hadn't happened in more than 12,000 years. The great bull of heaven, the creation of Adam. On the spring equinox of 3959 BCE, the first star of the constellation Taurus, Alnath, a double star, sets 14 seconds after sunset viewed from Jerusalem. Now, 14 seconds, considering there's 80,000+ seconds each day, that's an alignment of 99.98% on the exact sunset itself. Pretty amazing degree of accuracy. Now, here is a copy of my Starry Night 6 software that shows that information if you want to double check or do your own research. Now, this is interesting. On this slide we have the outline from the Dendera zodiac on the left, and on the right we have the image that my Starry Night software creates, and you can see they're radically different. In fact, if we use the first star that in the modern software zodiac sign as the beginning point, we don't match anything at all. It's only when we use the ancient one that we see the pattern. Now, there's another issue I should mention that makes this a little challenging, and that is what I call the 3 steps forward and 1 back cha-cha-cha. In other words, because the year has 365 1/4 days, what we tend to see is a pattern of 4 years. In other words, in 4 years, nothing happens. On the next pattern of 4 years, 1 star rate is, lags and sets after sunset. And then that goes on for a few years, and then 2 stars, a few years more, 3 stars, and a few years more, 4 stars. And from then on, it's always setting after sunset. But that pattern covers about 50 years. Interesting enough, in this case, the pattern is on the first of the series of 3. In other words, there's been 1 and then 2 stars, and the first time there's a series of 3 is the beginning point of this intersection. Could be chance, but I I don't think so. Okay, now if we look at our wheel of stars, we can see where we are. The arrow points to Taurus. We can even say something about where this occurs, because while our measurements are taken from Jerusalem, we can actually identify the location from the teaching, and that it says there are 4 rivers that come together and surround this land that Adam is created in, the Pison, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Well, the Tigris and Euphrates are well known to us today and have been all through history. There's a separate river that comes in from the direction of Iran, and there's a river that we now know has been discovered through satellite technology that's dried up and disappeared, that came in from Saudi Arabia. When those 4 rivers came together, they do so right at the edge of a city called Eridu. Archaeologists call this the first city on earth, and it truly is as far as our records. And the Sumerian word, that the Sumerian being the language of Eridu, the Sumerians called the flat river plain that stretched out in front of them, they called it Eden in their language. Now, Eridu, at the time of the giving of the teaching, was located right on the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. But things have changed over the years, and that is in 6,000 years, basically millions of tons of dirt and mud have been brought down the river. And so today, Eridu is now located about 140 miles from the Gulf itself. But at its height, it was in the intersection of these rivers and the Gulf. It was a perfect place for the trading of goods, being loaded and offloaded from river rafts to ocean-going vehicles, ships. If we look into history and what went on at that point, at the beginning, at 3959, this area was dominated by culture we know today as the Ubaids. And they were a people that wove the river foliage into huts and trees, or huts and buildings. They fished among the rivers. They harvested plants that grew in the wild there. They were seemingly a peaceful culture, and they had a place on the edge of the river which they had a small shrine, and that was to become the seat of the city Eridu. Now, in a matter of a few hundred years, this first city on earth springs forth. Within a few hundred years, it is a metropolitan area with stone buildings and massive trading centers and temples. It really is the beginning of civilization. We know it occurs at this moment in time. This is an illustration from S.N. Kramer's book, The History Begins at Sumer, and it shows what the artists believe that shipping area, that port, looked like. Now, Sumerians are given an amazing number of firsts. First written language, wagons and chariots, geometry, astronomy, coined money, international trade, written law, stone buildings, vast irrigation districts, courts and officers, division of labor. This is important, division of labor, because there were clan centers, there were villages in the world and had been for thousands of years before this. But nothing like a modern city where people gathered together and lived from multiple families and even ethnicities together. And here in Eridu we find tailors, we find bakers, pharmacists, policemen, attorneys. Virtually all the skills we know of as civilization, dyers and blacksmiths, these all come about in this very, very quickly in this one location. Also, this is the home of astrology. We know they're the first people, at least we have any knowledge of it, actually wrote down their thoughts on this, and we can track our images and our thoughts right back to this group of people. There's also something else that's important for our discussion. The people of Eridu and the Sumerians, as far as we can see in the very beginning, they were always polytheist. In other words, they believed in many gods, but they only believed one was worthy of worship. They called him Yah. Now, sometimes you will see the archaeologists and whatnot writing this as Ea, Yah, but you get the concept, Yah. Now, what's fascinating to me is basically 2,000 years later, when King David is on the run, he uses exactly the same term and calls out to his God to help him and protect him in his time of trouble. It's a name that connects the Hebrew scriptures with this most ancient name. They also had a title for him, not just a name, but a title, and that title was Enki, which again in Sumerian means Lord of the Earth. The second sign, though, comes up in 2904 BCE, and that's the Old Man. In the spring equinox of 2904 BCE, the first star of the constellation Perseus, Delta Persei, again a double star, set 16 seconds after sunset, viewed from Jerusalem. That's an accuracy again of 99.98%. Here's a shot of my software showing that moment. Even the modern representation, the first star is the same as the ancient star. Here we see our position on the wheel of stars. Now, interestingly enough, the birth of Noah in 2904 BCE, we have almost no record of other than what's written in the teaching itself. But there are documents that have, around the world. Number one is the fact that the flood myth is almost universal. Virtually every culture on earth has stories about a flood that occurred in ancient times. But there's a specific document called the King's List that has been unearthed in Mesopotamia, the same area as the Sumerians. And it records some very interesting things. It says that kingship descended from heaven. It was not a war or a fight, but heaven brought down a group of 10 ancient kings, righteous kings that they were, who ruled the land. And that list, regardless of its source, always ends with the same sentence. And then the flood came. In other words, that list of 10 kings, righteous kings, vanished when the flood. The next sign is the birth of Arphaxad in the spring equinox of 2301 BCE. The first star in the constellation we know is the Pleiades, Atlas, again as the others a double star, sets at the exact same second as the sunset is viewed from Jerusalem, a 100% perfect alignment. Arphaxad is almost unknown other than the fact that he was born 2 years after the great flood, the flood of Noah recorded in the teaching. His name, we're not exactly certain what it means because it's not a Hebrew name. It comes from another language. But best guesses are it means something along the lines of healer of wounds or healer of the breach. In other words, there was something he did that reconciled his self and his people back to their ancient God. Here we see the position on the wheel of stars. Now, interesting enough, I think I mentioned that the Pleiades is just a cluster of stars, and it's hard to say it really looks like anything. The Akkadians, again, followed behind the Sumerians, they called it the pine cone. Just this how do I say, variegated round, object. If you look at the Dendera zodiac, Perseus, which we identify as being the creation point of Noah, is holding something in his hand that looks a lot like that. It may be that the Dendera zodiac is showing this connections between the two. Connections were backed up by the story within the teaching. Now, tend to dismiss for many years the story of Noah and the flood as being how do I say, a mythology. But in the last few years, it's been uncovered about 10 years ago specifically, a structure called al-Bini Lake. It's been identified as a meteor impact site located in the delta lands of, next to Eridu. Here's a map that shows the relative location of Eridu and this meteor impact. Now you can see both of them are 100 plus miles inland at this point, but remember 6,000 years ago, al-Bini Lake was actually part of the ocean. And the best thought at this point is that the meteor impact fell about 70 miles from Eridu in the ocean. You can imagine something that blew out a crater 2 miles wide, less than 70 miles away in the ocean, would have thrown up tidal waves, tsunami waves that covered and erased, plus the water that was flashed into steam would fall back down as horrendous rain. We don't know exactly, we can't prove exactly the two are related, but it certainly suggests so. Whatever the cause, about 30 years after that event, according to the chronology of the teaching, a gentleman by the name of Sargon of Akkad takes over and begins the Akkadian dynasties that rule the area for many hundreds of years to follow. Some will say because he was a more savage leader and had more savage tribes, they took over the domesticated Sumerians. But I myself believe the vast majority of the Sumerians drowned before the invasion ever occurred. The next sign is Aries the ram, and it marks the birth of Moses. The spring equinox of 1527 BCE, the first star of the constellation Aries, 41 Arietis, again a double star, sets 7 seconds after sunset when viewed from Jerusalem. Again, a 99.99% alignment. Here's a screenshot of my Starry Night software. Here's the position on our wheel of stars, continuing upwards. Now, this marks the end of the dates which are given to us in the teaching. All dates are calculated from the teaching. The pattern is only discernible if we use the ancient zodiac. In other words, the modern one doesn't contain Pleiades, it doesn't contain Perseus. And as we mentioned earlier, the shape and size of the constellations has been altered too over time. All the observations take place at sunset. All of them occur on the spring equinox. All of them are taken from Jerusalem. And notice there's seemingly a significant number of them. There's a disaster right before the coming of this anointed king. Now, here we're leaving the history of the teaching and we're moving into prophecy. And that's important to understand. Where you're going to use the pattern, but not dates provided to us. Using the pattern of the previous constellations, the next constellation and the fifth sign is the binding cord. This matches the first Jewish war, the spring equinox of 70 CE, the current era. The first star of the constellations Pisces, Alratia, a double star again, sets 4 seconds after sunset, viewed from Jerusalem. Again, a 99.99% alignment. Here's our position in the wheel of stars. Here's the screenshot from my Starry Night software. Now, the first Jewish revolt. The Romans moving into the area, expanding their empire, had a pattern. They would enter into an area, they would make relationships with their factions in the area, they would start building alliances with them, and slowly through those alliances they would encumber them, entangle them, and eventually take over them. They would stop being sovereign countries, and they would start being provinces of the empire. And this is exactly the process they started with the Jews. Unfortunately, the Jews were much more resistant than most to this process. But nonetheless, the Jews revolted in the years before 70 CE, and Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, records 1.1 million civilians died in addition to military losses. The Romans record that 97,000 Jews were taken as slaves, and Jews were forbidden at the end of the war to even enter into Jerusalem. That's not exactly true. Stories are told that they were allowed to go to Jerusalem one day each year to mourn the loss of the temple in their capital city, and to, if you will, think about how bad they were in the process. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but the fact is that Jerusalem ceased to be the capital, and the people were scattered throughout the empire. Now, it's worth remembering that some estimates place the total Jewish population of the Roman Empire at approximately 10%, much higher than the population in society today. So they were a major part of the empire, and they had been at war and now, how do I say, estranged from the empire. This led to an event. In other words, the Jews being spread out and being, driven from their land. This brings about something called the Second Jewish Revolt. Again, the Romans referred to this revolt against the empire. Jews refer to it as war because they didn't view themselves as part of the empire. And this Second Jewish Revolt was something that is kind of covered up in history. But what happened is this: the Romans were facing another empire, what's called the Parthians. They were northern Mesopotamia at the time. And war was developing, in the time period after the First Jewish War. What happened is this: the Romans were gathering troops and sending them from throughout the empire to, take part in this war. That was leaving, skeleton crews in the areas where they normally resided. Jews rose up almost in unison around the empire, but especially in the eastern end of the empire, and led what we can only call the terrorist campaign. 400,000 Roman civilians were killed during this campaign. A much, much smaller number of Jews. This was not a disaster for the Jews, at least at first brush. But, it was the beginning of the Romans hating this ancient culture as being treacherous and dangerous. And it leads directly to an understanding of the next phase. The sixth sign, the first fish of Pisces. This comes about on 137 CE. It marks the beginning of the Third Jewish War. The first star of the constellation, Pi Andromedae, again another double star, sets 53 seconds after sunset, is viewed from Jerusalem. Now, I got to take a moment and just say, this is crucial to our understanding. On the left side of the screen, you see again the screenshot from my Starry Night software. There you see two fish drawn, being basically on adjacent sides of a square there we know as the square of Pegasus. That square of Pegasus is well known and gives us a perfect reference point. On the right, you see an image taken from the Dendera zodiac. There you see the fish are parallel, but on opposite sides of the square of Pegasus. And we can see their relative positions so we can identify what stars are applicable to them. Again, there's the square. Here's my Starry Night software, the capture of that moment. Now notice how that star is just above the horizon. These events are almost simultaneously occurring in historic terms. In other words, one ended in 70 CE, this one ended in 137 CE. But, there's a position at the star on the Wheel of Stars. Now, the First Jewish War, there were actually 4 separate factions that were vying for leadership, and this was a deadly, encumbrance to a unified nation at the beginning of the revolt. And eventually, the Romans massed their forces from across the empire and ended the war violently. The third Jewish war, though, was led by one single commander who come down to us as being, Simon Bar Kokhba. There are stories that he was actually a Roman general before he took over the Jewish forces, so understood their military extremely well. And for 2.5 years, he was amazingly successful. He waged, again, a guerrilla war in the area, and they created tunnels and caves throughout the whole of Israel. And his people, often with their entire families, lived in these areas. And then they would mass and spring out at night, attack the Romans, and disappear before the Romans could even muster their forces. It was amazingly successful against the weight of the empire. But again, the empire was vast. Eventually, they brought in, the required strength. And the history records 580,000 Jews were killed in combat. 50 towns were destroyed, 985 villages were razed, and untold numbers of victims of famine and disease. And in the end, the Jews were exiled, not from Jerusalem, but from Israel in total. But that's not the end. Again, the Romans were furious at this point. In their minds, they had been 3 revolts, that one killing, their women and children who were stayed behind. The Romans spent another year in the Holy Lands, basically setting up camps on mountains and hills throughout the land, waiting for signs of the Jews, the rebels, coming out of their caves and trying to either forage for food or trying to escape, and they slaughter them. The result is the Jewish nation just simply ceased to exist. Now we've left the ancient world and we're into modern times. This is the 7th sign on our series, the second fish of Pisces. At the spring equinox in 1949, the first star of the constellation the ancients knew as the Swallow, Matar, again a double star, sets 22 seconds after sunset as viewed from Jerusalem. Alignment accuracy of 99+%. Here's a screenshot from my software showing the position of Matar. Here's our position in the Wheel of Stars. We're nearing the top. Now, this time period, 1949, is actually, in Wikipedia it says this time of difficulty, identified as a Holocaust, begins in 1941, but it continues until 1949. Now, they define the Holocaust as a genocide during World War II in which Nazi Germany, aided by its collaborators, systematically murdered some 6 million European Jews, around 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe, between 1941 and 1945. It's horrible for what's happened here, but got to remember, it was horrible for the entire world. When we add to the military deaths, the deaths from famine and disease and revolution, most estimates are in excess of 160 million deaths in the course of the war. For the Jews, it's actually 3 separate events. One is the Holocaust in Europe from 41 to 45. Then the survivors that go back to their own homeland and have the War of Independence in 1948, which is a bloody battle for such a tiny country, but they still win. And then finally, following that win, there's the Arabic Exodus, which continues to 1949, in which the Jews are, in essence, being driven or fleeing back to their own land, out of the lands where they had coexisted with the Muslims for many, many hundreds of years. By the end of 1949, the Jews were reestablished as a nation after 18+ centuries of absence. Nothing like this had ever occurred in the world history. For our purposes, though, we look at this and we see there are basically 7 signs that occur, 7 constellations that mark key events in the history of these people from very, very ancient times, to literally the beginning of the written language, down to modern time. Interesting enough, just notice that every one of those is marked by a double star. Now, double stars are not that rare, but to see nothing but double stars is unusual. We would expect to see a split more like half and half. This sets a pattern. Again, for us, using Dionysius' count, it's the year 2018. If we add those years up in what they call the years of the world, Anno Mundi, we're in the year 5976, almost 6,000 years from the beginning of the count to modern age. Now, you've got to ask yourself, after seeing this pattern, were the stars in the sky positioned to reflect Jewish history, or was Jewish history manipulated to match the stars in the sky? I'm going to offer to you the most plausible explanation is, as we said in the beginning, an extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional civilization has been manipulating our universe, and it is using the stars in the sky as a form of communication with us. Now, if you don't accept that, you're what I call a coincidence theorist. You're looking at this pattern, it's right in your face, and you're saying, I don't see anything at all. We'll continue in the next presentation. We call it the Great One. We're going to see if we can extend this pattern into the future and into the past.